The night in Virginia was thick with the kind of silence that does not comfort but suffocates. Beyond the tobacco fields stretched a world of shadows, branches groaning in the wind as though whispering secrets the earth could not keep buried. Inside the grand plantation house, firelight pulsed against the walls, flickering gold across portraits of men who had built their wealth on chains. The master's goblet, polished to a cruel sheen, stood waiting upon the heavy oak table, an object of ritual and power, filled with the blood-red weight of imported wine. He did not see the hands that had prepared his meal, the hands that carried the scent of smoke and herbs, the hands that had never been free. To him, food appeared as though conjured, as though the cook herself were invisible. Yet those same hands had stirred something darker into the liquid that shimmered in his glass, something that carried centuries of hunger and grief. He raised the drink to his lips, unaware that every heartbeat was now counted, every swallow a descent into history's unrecorded vengeance. The air in the room shifted, a hush so absolute that even the flames seemed to bow in anticipation. This was not a banquet. This was an execution conducted with quiet ceremony, a death sentence written not with ink, but with bitterness laced in crimson. The first sip passed over his tongue with the indulgent warmth of routine, a luxury purchased with human agony. The second sip lingered bitter on his throat, though his mind dismissed it as a quirk of the bottle, perhaps a sour note in the cask. But the third sip drew his face into a contortion, a twitch that broke through the facade of mastery he carried like armor. His hand trembled against the stem of the glass, and the sound of crystal striking wood echoed louder than it should have, like a bell announcing judgment. Pain coiled inside his chest, sharp and faint. Rain, a violence his body could not command or control. His breath rasped out unevenly, dragging through his lungs as though the air itself had become poison. Eyes that once gazed with ownership upon the world widened with panic, a silent realization dawning in their depths, that his dominion could be undone, not by armies, not by courts, but by the unseen laborer who fed him. Somewhere beyond the dining hall, the kitchen stood in shadow, a place of heat and silence where a woman named Dinah had measured her courage not in hours or days, but in drops of venom. She had given him the intimacy of sustenance, and within that intimacy had planted the seed of death. The master staggered, clawing at the edge of the table, his veins burning with fire that came not from the hearth, but from a quiet rebellion distilled into liquid form. His collapse was neither noble nor grand, but a body surrendering to inevitability, falling as so many enslaved had fallen before him, though for different chains, different torments. The house did not weep for him. The walls bore witness in silence, as if they too had grown weary of the weight they held. The stillness after was heavier than the storm before. The goblet, tipped and spilling, left a dark stain on the wood, a mark that would not easily be scrubbed away. The room smelled of sweat and sour grapes, of a struggle that ended too quickly for cries to summon help. A single candle guttered in the draught, throwing grotesque shadows across the master's contorted face, his mouth frozen open as though pleading with a god who had long turned his gaze elsewhere. Somewhere outside, the wind howled, carrying the sound of distant laborers in the fields, their songs muted, unaware that within these walls the balance had shifted for one brief, fragile moment. Dinah did not appear in this chamber of death, and yet her presence haunted it more than the man who lay motionless upon the floor. She had wielded no blade, raised no musket, yet her act was rebellion in its purest, most terrifying form, an erasure of power delivered in silence. For generations, the enslaved had been forced to feed those who chained them, to sustain the very system that devoured them. But on this night, the ritual was reversed. The master had eaten his last meal prepared by a woman he did not see, and in tasting it, he tasted judgment. This was no accident, no divine strike from the heavens. It was human, deliberate, and intimate. The goblet lay shattered, not of glass but of illusion, the illusion that control could never be broken, that the enslaved were forever bound to serve without end. And in the echo of that silence, a story was born. A story carved not into monuments or ledgers, but into memory, into fear, into the whispered knowledge that sometimes even the smallest flame of defiance could scorch an empire. Virginia's soil was stained long before the master's wine ever darkened with venom. The plantation system thrived on a hunger so vast it could never be satisfied, a hunger not for bread or wine, but for wealth extracted from the very marrow of enslaved lives. In the pale light of morning, the fields spread outward like a sea of green, tobacco plants swaying in the humid air as if shackled themselves to invisible chains. Overseers rode along the rows, their eyes sharpened like blades, their voices cutting across the land with threats more biting than the lash they carried. Each day began before the sun, and stretched into an eternity of labor that bent backs, shredded hands, and filled lungs with dust and heat. Hunger lived in the bellies of the enslaved, gnawing, relentless, for their rations were scraps, crumbs stolen from abundance. But the true hunger belonged to those who owned the land, a hunger for control, for expansion, for dominion that could never rest. The plantation was not merely a home, it was a machine of suffering, fueled by flesh and silence, turning profit from pain. Its walls bore witness to countless unmarked stories, and within those walls, Dinah tended her fire, unseen yet indispensable, her life folded into the larger hunger that devoured all around her. Inside the kitchen, that hunger took on another form. The plantation's wealth was displayed not only in the acres of tobacco drying in barns, but also in the lavish meals that crowned the master's table. Imported spices, wines carried across the Atlantic, meats carved from enslaved labor, vegetables grown under sweat and punishment, all converged in dishes meant to impress, meant to remind guests of power's reach. Dinah stood at the center of this spectacle, her body both enslaved and indispensable, her skills demanded even as her humanity was denied. The kitchen was a theater of control, and Dinah its unwilling conductor, feeding those who starved her, creating feasts for men who would see her whipped for the smallest transgression. The heat of the hearth was constant, searing her skin, soaking her garments, yet no one saw her labor as worthy of recognition. The food appeared as if conjured, as though luxury were natural, not forged by toil. Dinah's hands carried both the burden of survival and the possibility of resistance, for in every meal lay the unspoken truth. Those who enslaved her lived because she fed them. And in the bitter heart of that truth, the hunger of the plantation grew monstrous, because it was never sated, never quiet, never full. Beyond the kitchen, the world pressed in with cruelty that seeped into every corner. Enslaved children carried water until their arms trembled. Men and women bent beneath the overseer's whip until their skin split into welts. Elders were worked until their bodies crumbled, discarded like broken tools. The plantation's hunger devoured futures, stripping away not just lives but legacies, erasing names into ledgers where people became property, their humanity reduced to ink on paper. Nights brought little rest, for even sleep was a cage filled with fear. Fear of punishment, fear of separation, fear of voices silenced forever. Yet in that darkness, whispers moved like wind through the quarters, whispers of freedom, of rebellion, of moments when the hunger could be turned against itself. For every lash there was memory, for every chain, a dream that one day the links might break. Dinah carried those whispers like embers, hidden but burning, as she stirred pots and salted meats. The plantation consumed everything it touched, but even within its insatiable appetite, there flickered the possibility of defiance. Hunger, after all, is dangerous, not only for the enslaved who felt it gnaw inside their bones, but for the masters who believed they could feast forever without ever tasting the bitterness of retribution. The kitchen was no sanctuary. It was a forge of fire and smoke where Dinah's life was shaped in silence. The walls were streaked with soot, the air heavy with the mingling scents of charred wood, salted meats, and bread rising slowly in the oppressive heat. For Dinah, every day was a performance of necessity, her movements honed into ritual, her body moving with practiced precision so that her presence faded into the background. Yet within this routine she commanded a kind of power that her captors never acknowledged, the unseen authority of sustenance. Every dish that passed from her hands to the master's table carried with it a hidden truth. The enslaved cook sustained the very system that crushed her. She learned to temper spices with patience, to stretch scraps into meals for herself and others in the quarters, to mask her thoughts beneath a veil of compliance. The overseer and the master glanced past her as though she were part of the furniture, a shadow in the corner, faceless and forgettable. But Dinah's invisibility was her cloak, and within it she observed. She watched the rhythms of the house, the careless cruelties of those who sat above her, the fleeting moments when their power could be undone. Every plate she served, every goblet she filled, carried the possibility of transformation, not in flavor alone, but in fate. Her mastery of the hearth was both her weapon and her shackle. The kitchen was a battlefield where the stakes were survival, each task performed under the weight of constant scrutiny. A misstep could bring punishment, a burned loaf could mean the lash, and yet she moved with a grace sharpened by fear. Her tools were iron pots, wooden spoons, knives dulled by endless work. But they were also instruments of knowledge. She knew which herbs soothed fevers, which leaves could curdle the stomach, which powders dissolved unseen in wine. This knowledge was inherited through whispers, passed from one enslaved woman to another, fragments of African memory stitched into the fabric of bondage. Dinah carried these fragments like secret weapons, tucked behind her quiet eyes, never spoken aloud. The master saw her as a cook, and nothing more, a body to bend to his appetite, but he never realized that she held dominion over his most vulnerable act, eating, drinking, trusting without thought. To him, her labor was invisible, but to her, it was the stage on which resistance might one day take shape. The hearth's flames licked at her arms, the sweat clung to her skin, but within the suffocating heat, she felt a different fire, one not of the stove, but of resolve. Every night when the house quieted and the embers dimmed, Dinah sat in the hush of the kitchen and breathed in the silence left behind. She thought of the countless meals that had passed through her hands, the endless cycle of feeding those who fed on her suffering. She wondered how many others before her had stood in this same room, stirring pots with dreams buried beneath the ash. In the stillness, her own thoughts became louder, harder to silence. What did it mean to hold such power, however veiled, and yet to remain unseen? She imagined her master's laughter at the table, his careless indulgence, his certainty that nothing could touch him within these walls. And then she imagined that laughter cut short, the goblet slipping from his grasp, the silence swallowing his voice forever. In the shadows, she became more than a cook. She became the keeper of possibility, the bearer of a secret truth, that power was not untouchable. The kitchen was a prison, but it was also a crucible, and Dinah, though bound by chains, carried within her the capacity to alter the course of her world with a single, deliberate act. In that dark room, where firelight flickered and silence pressed in, the shadow of rebellion began to take form, unseen but inevitable. The plantation was filled with rumors, and rumors were as dangerous as whips. They seeped into the quarters at night, carried on hushed voices that dared not rise above a whisper. Stories traveled across fields, across fences, across plantations, tales of enslaved men who slipped away into the woods, of women who fought back against their masters, of food and drink laced with substances that brought even the mightiest planter to his knees. Fear spread among the masters like wildfire whenever such tales reached their ears, for they knew how much they relied on the very people they dehumanized. They trusted their meals to hands they did not respect, their safety to bodies they claimed to own. And so the whispers grew, not just of rebellion with muskets and torches, but of rebellion far quieter, rebellion that looked like a sip of wine, a bite of stew, a breath that turned shallow and failed. Dinah heard these whispers while she stirred her pots, her face unreadable, her back straight, her hands moving as though nothing passed into her ears. Yet within her, each rumor planted a seed. She knew the price of being caught, knew the fire of punishment that awaited anyone suspected of defiance. But she also knew the truth these whispers carried, that power was not absolute, that even those who strutted in arrogance feared what they could not see. For Dinah, the kitchen became a chamber of possibility. Every jar, every pouch of herbs, every bottle on the shelf seemed to hum with a secret that only she could hear. There were powders that dulled pain, roots that twisted the stomach, berries that clouded the mind. Some enslaved women had passed on fragments of knowledge, scraps of wisdom inherited from mothers and grandmothers stolen across the ocean. These fragments were not written in books, but etched into memory, woven into survival itself. To the master, they were nothing but cooking women, but within their silence lived entire worlds of understanding. Dinah measured her thoughts carefully, never letting her face betray the storm within. Yet as she watched her master laugh at the table, his mouth stained with red wine, his fingers tapping with indulgence, the thought pressed harder against her heart. What if the meal she served could become the reckoning he never imagined? What if the goblet he raised in triumph became the chalice of his undoing? Each day she moved among the spices and salts with the same quiet obedience. But in her silence, the whispers became louder, almost deafening. They spoke not of fear, but of inevitability. The whispers were not just stories. They were warnings and promises intertwined. For every tale of resistance, there was another of the brutal reprisals that followed. Enslaved men hanged from trees, women beaten until their bodies could no longer rise, families torn apart as examples to others. Dinah knew these risks better than anyone, for the plantation's cruelty was no abstraction. It was her daily reality. Still, she carried the whispers with her, feeding them with every glance at the master's smug face, with every night she spent bent over the fire, exhausted yet unbroken. She did not speak her intentions aloud, for even walls had ears, and suspicion was a death sentence in herself. Instead, she let the silence carry her thoughts, waiting, watching, learning. The plantation lived on fear, fear of rebellion, fear of freedom, fear that the enslaved might one day rise as one. Dinah knew she was only one woman, bound and beaten by the structure of the world she was born into. Yet she also knew that one woman, unseen and underestimated, could still tip the balance. The whispers of poison were no longer just rumors. They had become a pulse within her veins, steady, unstoppable, calling her toward a moment that would shatter the illusion of her master's control. The house breathed with a silence that carried its own kind of weight, the silence before a storm that no one yet knew was forming. Dinah moved through the kitchen like a shadow, her steps steady, her face unreadable, her hands precise as she measured ingredients, stirred pots, and set the table for a feast that was meant to display her master's prosperity. The guests would not know her name, though every flavor that touched their tongues would carry her unseen presence. The master would not look her in the eye, though he depended on her for every indulgence, every taste of comfort. But Dinah had already chosen a path that would transform her from servant to executioner. In the stillness of the kitchen, where the heat of the hearth pressed against her skin, she reached for the jar that contained the powder no one was meant to see. It looked harmless, like any other spice, fine and pale against her dark fingers. Yet within its grains lay centuries of memory, centuries of suffering, centuries of rage that had crossed the ocean and buried itself in the silence of the enslaved. She did not tremble as she measured, did not hesitate as she stirred, for hesitation was the privilege of those who had nothing to lose. With each movement, she rewrote the script forced upon her, replacing obedience with defiance, invisibility with the most intimate act of rebellion, the act of feeding death to the man who had fed upon her life. The dining room was lit with the glow of candles, their flames dancing upon polished wood, silver cutlery, and glassware imported to flaunt wealth built on bondage. The master reclined in his chair with a pride that seemed eternal, a pride rooted in the belief that his place in the world was unshakable. His laughter rang against the walls as he boasted of his land, his crops, his power, every word a reminder that his empire was carved out of flesh. Dinah entered with the tray, her presence so familiar that it was invisible, her steps absorbed into the rhythm of service. She placed the dishes before him, poured the deep red wine into his goblet, and stood silent as he raised it with careless ease. To him, the act was nothing, a gesture repeated countless times across countless nights, as natural as breathing. But to Dinah, each second stretched into eternity. She watched his hand lift, watched the rim of the glass touch his lips, watched as he swallowed the darkness she had prepared. The liquid slid down his throat, carrying with it the weight of her choice, the fury of a lifetime, the whisper of generations who had never been allowed to speak their vengeance. For a moment, nothing changed. He continued speaking, his laughter swelling once more, but then his words broke, faltered, stuttered into silence. His smile twitched, his brow furrowed, his hand trembled against the stem of the glass. The sound of crystal meeting wood echoed in the chamber, sharp and final, a sound that seemed to split the air itself. He gasped as though the world had turned against him, clutching at his chest, his face twisting with pain and disbelief. His guests leapt from their chairs, confusion spreading like wildfire. But Dinah stood motionless, her eyes fixed on the man who had believed himself untouchable. Each cough was a confession, each spasm a revelation, each desperate claw at the tab lay an acknowledgement that his power had always been fragile. The poison worked swiftly, unraveling him from the inside, burning away the illusion of dominance he had worn like armor. He fell to the floor, convulsing, his body surrendering to a fate he could neither fight nor flee. Around him, voices rose in panic, chairs toppled, footsteps thundered through the hall. But over it all was the sound of his choking, the ragged, broken sound of a man brought low not by armies, not by fire, but by a sip of wine delivered by the woman he had never thought to fear. The candle flames flickered, as though bowing to the moment. Shadows stretched long across the walls, and the house seemed to hold its breath. Dinah, standing in the doorway, became both witness and author, both servant and rebel, her silence the sharpest blade of all. In that instant, the plantation's order cracked, and the air was filled not with triumph, but with inevitability. For when the wine darkened, it was not just a man who fell. It was the illusion of control, the pretense that bondage was unbreakable. In the space between his last breath and the silence that followed, history shifted, carried by the unseen hands of the cook in the shadows. The master's body had not yet grown cold before suspicion spread like wildfire through the plantation. Panic clung to the walls of the great house, dripping from every frantic whisper, every trembling command. Guests who had fled the dining room carried terror in their eyes, terror that the very hands which fed them could also deliver death. The overseers wasted no time. Their voices cracked like whips as they summoned men to scour the quarters, to drag forth anyone who might have known, anyone whose silence now looked like guilt. Dinah was seized in the kitchen, pulled from the hearth that had been both her prison and her power. Rough hands gripped her arms, yanking her into the open, into the torchlight, where fear demanded a spectacle. Her face did not flinch, though the world around her spun with shouts and curses. She knew this moment had always been waiting, crouched in the shadows of possibility. The lash could not erase the fact that her act had already been carried out, that her master's last drink had sealed a truth which no punishment could undo. Yet the fury of the plantation demanded blood, demanded a lesson etched into flesh to remind all who watched what defiance cost. Chains closed around her wrists. not as tools of labor now, but as instruments of retribution, binding her for a trial she would never truly be given. They paraded her before the others, forcing every enslaved man, woman, and child to watch, to see what awaited those who dared to strike at the foundation of their torment. The punishment was not just for Dinah, it was for all of them, a theater of cruelty meant to silence even the thought of rebellion. Torches cast long shadows across the yard as overseers barked their condemnations, their words dripping with rage and fear in equal measure. To the masters, poison was not just murder, it was betrayal, a violation of the fragile trust that allowed them to eat and drink without terror. And so they made her body the canvas upon which their vengeance was painted. The lash tore across her back, each strike a public sermon, each scream dragged from her throat a warning to the crowd. Children buried their faces in their mothers' skirts. Men clenched their fists until their nails broke skin. Women stood silent, their eyes fixed upon Dinah, as though to carry her courage within themselves. The cruelty seemed endless, stretching time until the night itself bled into eternity. And still Dinah endured, her silence heavier than the overseer's shouting, her defiance written not in words, but in the act that had already stolen her master's breath. They could break her body, but they could not unmake the truth that she had proved. Power could bleed. When the punishment was finished, her body lay broken, but her story was already alive in the hearts of those who had witnessed it. The masters believed they had reasserted control, that they had stamped out the spark before it could spread. They did not understand that brutality often fertilizes the soil where memory grows. In the quarters, whispers took root again. Whispers not of fear alone, but of remembrance. They spoke her name quietly, reverently, as though it were forbidden scripture. The kitchen that once rang with the clatter of pots became hollow without her presence, its silence heavy, accusing. Every meal that followed was touched by the ghost of her defiance. Every goblet lifted by trembling hands that could never again drink without tasting the possibility of betrayal. Dinah had been punished, erased in body, but her act remained carved into the marrow of the enslaved community. The chains of retribution had bound her, but they could not bind the idea she had set loose, that even in the deepest shadow of oppression, resistance could take form, silent yet devastating, carried not by armies or fire, but by a single hand, a single choice, a single poisoned cup. The kitchen, once alive with the steady rhythm of Dinah's labor, now stood in eerie silence. Pots hung unused, their iron bellies darkened but cold, and the hearth, once fed daily by her careful hand, sputtered without conviction under the watch of those forced to take her place. The air carried absence more than smoke, a hollow reminder that the woman who had commanded this space had been torn away. For the enslaved who passed the doorway, the kitchen became something more than a room of fire and sustenance. It became a shrine of memory. They did not speak her name loudly, for fear still pressed heavy on their chests, but in the hush of the night, it slipped between them like a prayer. Children who had once darted through the yard asking for scraps now looked at the kitchen with wide, uncertain eyes, sensing that something sacred and dangerous had transpired there. Every plate that left that room, every goblet filled, was shadowed by the thought of what Dinah had done. The masters believed they had erased her by breaking her body, but the walls still remembered, and so did every soul who had ever tasted the bread she baked or watched her carry steaming dishes toward the table of her oppressor. The kitchen itself had become a ghost, and Dinah's presence clung to its smoke-stained stones like a shadow that could not be banished. For the enslaved community, her memory was a spark passed quietly from lip to ear. Around the fire at night, when overseers slept and stars pierced the black sky, whispers told her story, not as crime, but as courage. They spoke of the goblet, of the moment the master's face twisted in disbelief, of the silence that swallowed him whole. Some voices trembled with fear as they recounted the punishment that followed, the lashes, the chains, the spectacle of cruelty. Yet even as fear lingered, so too did a deeper recognition. Dinah had proven that Ware was not invincible. Her body had been destroyed, but her act endured, etched into memory not as defeat, but as defiance. Mothers told their daughters in low voices, warning them of the danger, yet also reminding them of the strength that lived within quiet hands. Men repeated the story to one another as they bent in the fields, their backs aching, their spirits burdened, finding in her act the smallest flicker of dignity reclaimed. The master's version of the story called her a traitor, a killer, a shadow meant to terrify others into submission. But in the quarters, she became something else entirely, an unspoken legend, a reminder that even within the suffocating confines of bondage, one could carve a mark deep enough to echo beyond death. The years moved forward, as relentless as the seasons that dictated planting and harvest, yet Dinah's ghost lingered. New hands tended the hearth, new voices echoed through the quarters, but the memory did not fade. The kitchen never returned to what it had been before, for everyone who crossed its threshold carried the knowledge of what had happened there. The masters ate with a shadow of unease, their confidence cracked by the thought that any sip might betray them. The enslaved carried the story like contraband, hidden but powerful, a weapon of memory that no overseer could confiscate. Dinah's echo was not one of victory, for victory was impossible in a world bound by chains, but it was an echo of disruption, of defiance, of the simple truth that no empire of cruelty could ever be completely secure. Her absence was presence, her silence was voice, and her ghost haunted not only the kitchen, but the very structure of the plantation itself. The fire of rebellion had been doused in her blood, yet its smoke still curled upward, impossible to erase. She remained, not in body, but in story, an echo that reminded every soul who remembered her that even the smallest act of defiance could resound like thunder through the halls of power. History does not always speak in thunder. Sometimes it whispers through a single act, a moment almost invisible in the grand sweep of time. Dinah's story was one such whisper, carried in the silence of a kitchen, hidden in the crimson depths of a goblet. The world of the plantation sought to erase her, to make her name nothing more than a cautionary tale, a line in a record meant to frighten the enslaved into obedience. Yet the truth is that Dinah carved her defiance not into paper or stone, but into memory. Memory that survived in the mouths of those who whispered it to their children. Memory that lingers even now, centuries later, when we try to imagine her face, her hands, her breath, as she stood by the fire. Her master's death was not merely an end. It was a rupture in the illusion of invincibility that the plantation system cloaked itself in. Every sip of wine that followed on plantations across Virginia carried the ghost of that moment, an unspoken reminder that the enslaved were never simply passive, never simply broken. Dinah's act teaches us that power can always be pierced, that even in the most suffocating darkness, the human spirit still searches for a crack through which to breathe. She was punished with chains, whipped into silence, erased from the record. But erasure is never complete. Memory survives where ink fails, and her story is proof that rebellion, however quiet, can never be entirely buried. The lesson of Dinah's goblet is not only about defiance, it is about the unbearable cost of oppression. Her choice was born not from freedom, but from captivity, not from peace, but from endless torment. The weight of her decision cannot be separated from the world that forced it upon her, a world that demanded silence, yet created the conditions for resistance. To imagine Dinah standing in her kitchen, adding death to the goblet, is to confront the desperation and courage braided together in the act. It is to realize that rebellion was never clean, never easy, never without terrible consequence. The aftermath of her action was cruelty multiplied, pain inflicted on her body, and fear spread among her people. And yet, in that brief instant when the master choked on his wine, the world shifted, if only by a fraction. Dinah reminds us that resistance does not always appear as armies or proclamations. It can live in the quietest corners, in the hands of those history tried to erase, in the silence that becomes louder than any shout. Her story lingers not to glorify death, but to bear witness to the lengths to which a human being might go when stripped of dignity, of freedom, of life itself. The goblet she poisoned was not just a vessel of wine. It was a mirror, reflecting the fragile truth that no system built on blood could ever rest secure. We are left, then, with the echo of her choice, a story heavy with sorrow, yet also lit by the fire of defiance. Dinah forces us to ask the questions history often avoids. What would we do in her place, bound by chains, stripped of autonomy, yet holding the power to act? What does it mean to seek justice when the law itself is injustice, when every path leads to punishment, yet silence means slow death all the same? Her act is not easily judged, nor should it be, for it belongs to a world where morality was twisted by brutality, where survival itself was an act of resistance. But what we can say is this: Dinah's story deserves to be remembered, spoken aloud, carried forward, not as an isolated tale, but as part of the larger truth of resistance that pulsed within the enslaved communities of America. Her goblet was one of many acts, small, quiet, unseen, that struck at the foundation of slavery, each one reminding us that oppression never silences the will to fight back. And as we tell her story now, across centuries, across voices, across screens, we honor that memory. To remember Dinah is to refuse the erasure that bondage sought to enforce. It is to lift her whisper into thunder. It is to hold the lesson of the goblet in our hands and know that history does not belong only to the victors. It belongs also to the cooks, the shadows, the women who dared to lace silence with defiance. Let her name be spoken. Let her story be known. And let us carry it forward, for memory itself is resistance, and forgetting would only finish the work her oppressors began. Stories like Dinah's are not meant to be consumed and forgotten. They are meant to linger, to haunt, to demand that we look at history not as dates and ledgers, but as blood, fire, and silence. Every time her name is spoken, the silence of the plantation kitchen is broken once more, and her defiance breathes again. To hear her story is to inherit its weight, to feel the tension of a goblet raised in arrogance and emptied in ruin. But her memory survives only if it is carried, only if it is passed onward, only if we refuse to let the chains of forgetting bind her a second time. That is where you, the listener, step into the story, not as spectators, but as keepers of her whisper. The act of remembering is itself a rebellion against erasure. When you share Dinah's name, when you keep her story alive, you resist the silence that history tried to impose. You transform a tale nearly lost into one that endures, carved into the present, as surely as it was once carved into whispered memory among the enslaved. If her goblet was an act of defiance, then your voice can be one too. A voice that ensures her act is not dissolved into dust. To let others know, to press forward this story, is to deny the plantation its final victory of obscurity. So let this be more than the end of a tale. Let it be the continuation of her echo. Carry it with you, share it, breathe it into the world beyond this screen. And if you would stand with Dinah against the silence, let your presence here be known, by leaving your thoughts, by adding your voice, by subscribing to ensure these stories are not swallowed by time. Each action is a candle lit against the dark. Each click, each comment, each share is a refusal to let memory die. The goblet has long since shattered, but its lesson endures. To remember is to resist. And tonight, by keeping Dinah's story alive, you join her whisper in becoming thunder.